Hello everybody, my name is Deane, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about this RZ500 that I restored. So if anybody has any questions while I'm talking here, please put up your hand and ask the question, and if I can answer the question, I will be happy to do that. So just to give myself a little bit of a street cred here about who I am. Basically, I've been an aircraft maintenance engineer since around 1980. I worked with Ted Hector for a time being at a company called Air Manitoba, and I also worked for about 30 years with Bill Fraser, the fellow that did the movie about Ted Hector, the movie Salt. So I was very good friends with Bill, spent a lot of time with him. So that's me back in the day up north somewhere working on a broken old airplane. And these are some of the airplanes that I've worked on. The one in the yellow one is a CL-215 water bomber, so I spent a lot of summers following that around, maintaining it. This one is a Curtiss Commando C-46. I spent a lot of time on that as a flight engineer. DC-3, we flew those all up north. We did freight hauls up to all the different native reserves and that. So I was above the Arctic Circle, and these were my plane tickets home. So if they broke, I was stuck with them until I could actually make it run and get home. So it wasn't like getting on Air Canada and flying home. This bottom corner one, that's a Hawker Siddeley 748, made in Britain. So yeah, I always say British junk, but I can say that because I own 2 British motorcycles, so I can get away with it. These are the engines that I worked on, the R2800. It's 18-cylinder, 2,100 horsepower supercharged engine. That was on the CL-215 water bombers and the C-46. This one here is a R985, so you see those on lots of float planes. They're a 9-cylinder, about 450 horsepower. Down here is a Rolls-Royce Dart turbine engine. That was on the Hawker Siddeley 748. And this one here, Pratt & Whitney R1830, that was about 1,400 horsepower. So you could change the cylinders on these engines in the field and get them running again if they blew a cylinder, which they did quite often. So let's get to the motorcycles. These are the bikes I once owned. I was going to be the big racer, but that was an epic failure. It cost me a lot of money and I was no good at it, so I gave that up. And then I went and got a RZ500 street bike, so that was a lot better. All right, so these are the bikes I own now. This is the RZ500 that I restored, and I have a little brother there, an RZ350. That one I didn't have to restore. I bought it, and it was, I just kind of went through the carburetors and tires and stuff like that, so that was an easy one. That's my Triumph Bonneville 750 and my Norton Atlas, and then Anne Margaret, she comes over and borrows my Norton and goes for a ride on it and that, so that's kind of cool.
That was her lucky day.
Yeah. So let's see what the critics say about the RZ500. So they say it's a Grand Prix racer replica for the road, and so it was kind of when they first bikes that they came out with full fairings on it and that, and it was kind of a sensation. So what the magazines say in a head-to-head racetrack contest, an Annihilate 750 four-stroke stomps the Honda VF1000 and is likely to be consistently bested only by the Kawasaki GP900. And the RZ500 becomes a rocket ship once the tack swings past 7,500 RPM and stays that way well past the 10,000 RPM red line. So it's a fun bike, and it was inspired by the YZR500 factory racer ridden by Kenny Roberts, and it's got a twin crank V4, the closest thing to a Grand Prix bike with lights that you can get your hands on. So that's what the magazines are saying, but Let's see what Mr. Roberts says. It's in a V configuration. So Mr. Roberts was asked if he owned one. He says, no, there's way too many mistakes between two wheels. So they're kind of a finicky bike to work on. So they made a few different, they were all the same engine and everything, but they made the fairings a little bit different. The Canadian and Australian ones were in the, were in this one in this corner. And then the British ones, they looked a little different. And the Japanese model, that was, what was different about that one, it had an aluminum frame instead of the steel frame. And they detuned the engine because of some regulations in Japan. So basically they detuned the engine by restricting the exhaust. Yeah, so I've just talked about all of that. And they were produced between 84 and 86, and they've become a sought-after collector's item. So this is a horsepower chart for them, and so the factory says that it has 88 horsepower at the rear wheel. On the dyno, it's 67 horsepower at the rear wheel. Standing quarter mile, they say it does 11.7 seconds at its 117 miles an hour, and it has a top speed of almost 150 miles an hour. So if you look at the power band, you can see that it rises pretty quickly. So when it comes on the pipe, you know it, you have to hang on. So it uses a 50-degree twin crankshaft V4 engine layout and linked with the Yamaha power valve system exhaust power valves. And I'll talk about those later on. And they're controlled by an electronic unit and a servo motor that are designed to give a broader power band with it. So the power valve reduces the size of the exhaust port at low RPMs to provide better low RPM power, and then it opens at higher RPM to open the exhaust port up to give you your high RPM power. And you can see basically it's a round, it rotates, it's a round valve that rotates and restricts the exhaust port, and then it can open up the exhaust port. There's what these are the what they look like. You can see they're round, and yeah. So basically they rotate in bushings, and the manual recommends them to be lubricated with a high temperature grease because they're right in the hottest part of the cylinder in the exhaust. So I used lithium grease on the bushings, and then I actually used Permatex anti-seize on the rotating part. So as it would help it from getting carboned up, because once they get carboned up, they won't rotate properly or fast enough. So the lower expansion chambers, they exit normally, but the upper ones cross over each other behind the exhaust ports to maintain the correct tune length. So they're right under your seat, and you can see the upper ones, they have all of this shielding around them to keep your butt cool, but in the summertime it sometimes doesn't work so well. The engine features reed valve intake reed valves. The reed valves use two different intake arrangements. So the lower cylinders are fed through the crankcase mounted reeds, and the upper pair use the cylinder. So you can see here the lower cylinders, this circle here is where the carburetor hooks onto, and then it goes straight down into the crankcase. Whereas the upper cylinders, this is where the carburetor hooks up to. You can see it doesn't go straight into the crankcase, but it goes into the bottom of the cylinder. So I'll just talk about reed valves a little bit. The purpose of the reed valve on a two-stroke is to stop the fuel from bouncing back through the carburetor again. So basically what happens when your piston comes up, it draws your fuel air mixture into the crankcase. And when it comes down, you've got the velocity of the fuel coming through the carburetor. It hits the piston and stops, but that energy has to be dissipated somewhere. So what happens is it'll get bounced back through the venturi of the carburetor again, picking up another load of fuel from the float hole. And then when your piston comes up again and makes a low pressure area in the crankshaft, your air is going to come through your air box, pick up the fuel that had just come back, and then pick up another load of fuel from your float bowl. So you're getting an excessively rich mixture, which would be hard to jet for. So with the reed valve, it opens and closes at the same speed that the piston is opening and closing, and it blocks the fuel air mixture from bouncing back through the venturi of the carburetor. Let's see what else I got here. Yeah. Anybody have any questions on that? Good? Perfect. So it has 26 millimeter carburetors. You can see they're ganged together, and you can see down at the bottom here, these are where the carburetors hook up to. So you can see they go through a 90-degree angle, which is for performance engines. That's not a hot setup. So, but that's what these have. And they're basically a Mikuni carburetor. They're a little bit different because they don't have the slide that is pulled by a cable up at the top. It's got a little lever action kind of thing in here, but the rest of the carburetor is pretty similar. So the dual crankshafts, they're geared directly to the clutch, while the front crankshaft also drives a counterbalancer shaft mounted between the two crankshafts, and the counterbalance shaft on it assists in dampening the engine vibrations. So we had a question about the dual cranks. So here's one crankshaft, and here's the other crankshaft, and this is the clutch, and this is where they're geared together through the clutch. And then this is your counterbalance shaft, and there's your weight, and it's got a little 90-degree angle in here. And it's geared to this crankshaft here. So the engine's basically cooled by a radiator and a fan, and lubrication is direct injection into the inlet manifolds. You can see that here. These are your oil lines, your inlet manifold, those quirky little 90-degree ones. And normally controlled in other two-stroke engines by throttle position. This engine oil pump is controlled by the Yamaha power valve system servo motor, and it ensures the oil supply is not shut down at high engine revolutions. So I'll talk about that a little bit. With lots of oil-injected two-strokes, or even ones with premix, if you do a high-speed run, say down the drag strip or across a lake if you're on a snowmobile, your engine is at its hottest temperatures. So if you let go of the throttle, all of a sudden you don't have the nice cooling of your fuel air mixture, and if the oil pump is controlled by the position of the throttle, well, your oil pump closes. So now your engine is nice and hot, it wants cooling, it wants oil, and if it's on a motorcycle and the back wheel is still driving the engine at a high RPM, you're going to have a burn down. So you see lots of people after they do a high-speed run, and what I recommend is you cycle the throttle back and forth as you're slowing down. That opens the throttle, opens your oil pump, and allows the engine to cool down properly. With this Yamaha power valve system, it's not linked to the position of the throttle or the opening of the carburetor. It's based on the engine RPM. So it's still, even though the throttle's closed and you're not getting the airflow through there, the oil pump is still pumping hard and putting oil into your engine and your cylinders, and so it's a really good system. It's a little bit quirky to set up, but once it's set up, it works really well. So it's a basic 6-speed transmission, 1 down, 5 up. What's interesting about it, it's a cassette style, so you can take the transmission right out, and if you're like a factory team and you have a different transmission with different gear ratios, you can put it for different racetracks. The frame is basically a mild steel box section, and the rear shock absorber is placed underneath. Whoops, I keep doing that. It's placed underneath, and this piece of the frame comes out. It's bolted in, and that's how you can change your engine. So the magazines, and also the fellow that I bought this bike off of, said that at high speed it gets a high-speed wobble to it. So I'm not sure, but I think a lot of it might due to the flex caused by that bolted-in piece. Because when I did this motorcycle, the holes were elongated. So what I did was I reamed them out, and then I put in aircraft grade interference fit bolts in there to tighten it up. But I will never find out if it's going to work, because I'm never going to go that fast on it. I don't have the willpower for that. So the rear shock absorber connects to aluminum alloy swinging arm by several forged rocker arms. The underseat is occupied by this upper exhaust, the oil pump, one-way valves, battery. It's kind of nice to work on because you can just flip that. You take one bolt out the front of the tank and you can rotate it up like that, and you can change your spark plugs and work on stuff, get your battery and whatnot. So it's got a 16-inch front wheel and it's got an 18-inch back wheel. When I restored this bike, I had no problem getting any of the engine parts or brakes or anything like that. I had to wait a summer that I couldn't ride the bike for a 16-inch front tire. So some restoration notes. There's the bike when I bought it. The engine was in a box, and then there it is now. I've been riding it last summer. So let's see if I can get a first start on here. I think we got a little video here.
Oh, look, it burns oil.
Yeah. I don't know if you can hear the engine there. I got this cranked right up.
Yeah. It's good before the fan kicked in.
Oh. So I use a lot of oil during assembly. So you'll see it's going to have a lot of oil there.
Sure. Makes sense.
It's going to get interesting in a minute. So it doesn't want to run on all four yet.
Don't get mosquitoes.
There we go. So that was basically the first start. So there's the engine. I had it all laid out there when I took it apart, just on the deck. Who said two strokes are simple? There's a lot of gears and whatnot going along there. So I put in the aftermarket pistons. These ones are coated. Basically, some advice: if you're trying to push your piston pin in and out, don't hit it with a hammer and try to tap it in or out. I found what usually works really good is you take a heat gun and heat up that area there, and you should be able to push it in and out by your fingers, providing you don't burn your fingers. So what I do when I rebuild a two-stroke is the bottom of the cylinder, or the bottom of the, all along here on the piston, I put a chamfer that, put like a radius on it. The reason I do that is because when your piston comes down, if it's got a sharp edge there, it'll scrape the oil off your cylinder, and your ring's right behind it, and it's going to be having a lack of oil on the cylinder. So that radius allows the oil to stay between the cylinder and the piston. Another thing I do, I didn't do it on these ones because they're coated, but I also put a cross hatch, just like you would on your cylinder, on the piston to hold oil, and I find that helps out. Another thing I do is I don't change the port timing, but I clean up all the ports for flow on any two-cycle engine that I do. So when you think about it, at 6,000 RPM, there's stuff happening in that engine 100 times a second. So your airflow wants to get in there 100 times a second. And if you have an engine like this one that goes 10,000 RPM, stuff needs to move at 166 times a second. So to clean up all your ports and radius them, and that will help airflow. So you can look, basically what I do is I look at the engine and see how the air would flow through it. If there's any sharp 90-degree angles, I remove all of those. And you can see that here's one that came from the factory, and here's how I've radiused it so there's no turbulence from the fuel air mixture trying to go around that corner. It smooths it out a little bit. Also, make sure your ports are the same size. This is the exhaust port. So the blue part in there is what overhung into the exhaust pipe area from the gasket. So what I did is I removed that blue there, and that came out to about 5 millimeters, like 2.5 millimeters on each side. Now, you don't want to take that 5 millimeters out of the exhaust track, because you want to keep the exhaust track, the stock, so as you get the velocity through there. But where the exhaust pipe mates to the port there, that's where you want to not have a ridge, so as the exhaust can come back in to which we'll talk about later. The way a tune pipe works, it pushes some of the fuel air mixture back into the cylinder. So another thing I do is I match the ports in the cylinder to the actual cylinder, the aluminum cylinder part. You'll find it lots of times if you have a pressed in liner, cast iron liner, there may be aluminum hanging over into the port from the cylinder itself. So remove that aluminum and make it match the same size as the actual port. Yeah, so you'll find that on the exhaust ports and your transfer ports. Just clean those up a little bit. Another thing I do is I cut the cylinder base gaskets to make sure that they don't hang over into the crankcase, because this is where your transfer port comes up. And if if your cylinder base gasket is hanging over there, it's just going to cause turbulence and slow down the airflow. So that's another trick that you can do. So does matching the ports work? The magazine tests say that the engine gets on the pipe between 7,000 and 7,500 RPM. With my porting that I did on this, I think I gained about another 1,000 pounds of use, or 1,000 RPM of useful RPM, because my bike comes on very strong at 6,000 RPM, between 6,650 or 6,500 RPM. It comes on really strong then. So just cleaning up the ports makes a big difference. I know I've done it lots on snowmobiles, and it may not give you more horsepower, but the engine sure runs better and you get better fuel mileage. So let's talk about breaking the glaze on cast iron cylinders. On a two-stroke, I wouldn't recommend using a ball hone because they get stuck in the ports and you could wreck your horn. I use a variable speed drill and a flexible cylinder hone with lots of oil. What I do is try to get that speed as slow as possible. So I actually grab the drill with my hand and then feather the trigger and slow the drill down with my hand, so as you're not having to go super fast. You can just go nice slow and get your 45-degree crosshatch on your cylinder. So a lot of modern engines, like I know the snowmobile engines for sure, the motocross engines, they're using this Nicocel plated cylinders, which is just a very, very thin plating that's put on through a lot of heat of this Nicocel. And so basically, if you're working on that, follow the manufacturer's directions, because some manufacturers say you don't break the glaze on that. You just put in your new rings and away you go. If you do want to try breaking the glaze on it, I would recommend just doing it by hand with some sandpaper and just that way you're not going to go through it because it's very thin. And if you use a hone and you chip that Nicocel, your cylinder's done. You got to get it replated or get a new cylinder. So removing aluminum from a scored cylinder, I use muriatic acid. If you use that, wear all your PPE safety equipment. Don't get that acid on any part of the aluminum cylinder that you don't want to have damaged. And just work at it slowly with an acid brush and you should be able to get it off the cylinder. I find if you have a cylinder that's got some score marks on it and they're not too deep, I just leave them in there. Because they just hold oil, give you more lubrication on the cylinder. So, but if they're really deep, then you have to do something about it. But a little bit, they're generally around the exhaust port, and that's where you want your oil. So after breaking the glaze, you need to clean it good. So I clean it with gas or solvent, and then I use hot water, boiling water with Dawn dish soap. The hot water, boiling water expands the crosshatch, and the fine particles you can wash out. And once you've used the water on it, you need to obviously put some oil on there to stop corrosion. So there's your flex hone, that's what I use. And then there's your ball horn, which I don't use. So this is my engine sitting on the bench ready to go in. So this is how I break in an engine. Now, I'm not saying it's the only way to break in an engine. I'm sure everybody has different methods, but this one works. So basically what I do is I start it up and I just run it a little more than idle. That allows the rings to be expanded against the cylinder wall, which is exactly what you want to be doing when you're breaking an engine in. And then once it becomes too hot to touch, or I see the needle on the temperature gauge coming up, I'll shut it down and let it cool down. So I'll do that a few times, and then after doing that 3 or 4 times, I'll take it for a short ride and just stay in the lower power band range. But as I'm driving it, I'll roll the throttle on, so the engine is sort of in a bog situation. That expands the rings hard against the cylinder wall and allows them to bed in. So I'll take it for a few rides, let it cool down, take it for a few rides like that. When you're cooling it down, that's the good time to check your spark plugs, check for leaks, check for different noises and that. And then once you've done your 15-minute rides for 3 or 4 times, then you can start running it a little bit harder. But remember, always roll that throttle on so as you're expanding the rings against the cylinder wall to bed them in. And anyway, that's how I do it. So, yeah, this is what we've talked about. Yeah, you can use that on four-stroke engines also. So there's always the question, should additional oil be added for break-in? Well, I think back in the day, when oil wasn't what it is today, yes, it was probably a good idea. Today with the synthetic two-stroke oil, this is what I use, is that Shell Ultra snowmobile oil. And they're running 250 horsepower snowmobiles on that oil with no issues. I have a 170 horsepower snowmobile from the factory. I run that in and I can pin it across Falcon Lake for 5 miles and it doesn't blow up, which, you know, a lot of that has to do with the oil. So when I break them in, I don't put in extra oil. I just use a very good oil and do that break-in method I explained. So my engine, as you saw it running good there, it ran very good, and then all of a sudden it started not running very good. When I put the bike together, it had sat for many years, and I ran water through the exhaust, all 4 exhaust pipes, and all kinds of squirrel stuff came out, peanuts and leaves and you name it, everything they had in there. So I rode it for a while, and it ran good, and then it started running worse and worse and worse. And I did a lot of troubleshooting, chasing ghosts around. I changed the front coils. I went through the carburetors again, which I didn't really think was a problem. I retimed all the crankshafts and stuff like that. Thought maybe what was happening is the 2 lower cylinders, they would get warm, but the plugs would be wet, and out of the exhaust, it wasn't like the pop, pop, pop. It was just smoking like the end of a cigarette. So I pulled the plugs out, and they had all kinds of, I'll show you the next slide, had all kinds of crap on them. So it wasn't metal, thank God, and that gave me the thought that it was the exhaust. So this is some of the stuff that I pulled out of the exhaust pipe. That's like batting or something from inside of a blanket or a sleeping bag, and it had plugged up the exhaust pipes, and the engine couldn't breathe anymore. So there's what the spark plugs look like. That was my first hint of where to go for the troubleshooting. But it confused me because the bike ran good for a while. Then I guess the heat and vibration did that. So I cleaned it all out, put it all back together, rode it, ran good again until bang, the same thing happened again. And one got so plugged up that I couldn't get anything through it. So I took it to the car wash, and I figured, I'm going to put the high pressure car wash hose through there. It's going to fix everything. All I got was real wet. Sheets came out. So the cure was I went and rented a Tiger torch and got a propane tank, and I took that exhaust pipe, laid it in the ground, and I heated that up with that Tiger torch for about 20 minutes. And finally it started to smoke and burned all that crap out, and that was the cure. That fixed it. Special tools that I use, special products, Dawn dish soap, as I explained. Gotta love that stuff, it works for everything. Homemade clutch tool. I just took a couple of pieces of angle iron and cut them to fit, or drilled them to fit the clutch, and then I could get all the clutch off and all the gears. My Nissan Xterra bead breaker, that worked really well. I don't like taking my stuff to the shop, so I just build whatever I need to do to fix it. This is a good one. So people that have a brake caliper with dual pistons or triple pistons, you can use, if you have a single piston, you can use air pressure and pop that piston out when you're rebuilding it, right? But as soon as you pop one piston out, now you can't get the other one out. How do you do that? So I thought about that for a while. So basically what I got is a piece of threaded rod and put 2 bolts on it. I cut it to a little bit smaller than the inside of the piston. And then these outside bolts, they're just bearing bolts that these ones bear up against and tighten it up against the piston. tightened it all in there, and then I got a ratchet strap, wrapped it around there, wrapped it around the other part of the piston, and out it came. So there's a little trick for you guys. Seal loop, this is an aviation product that works really good. It works good on paper gaskets, any aluminum fittings that you don't want to gall up and get stuck together. It stops all that. So I was talking to Ted Hector one day, and he says, "You got any of that seal lube, Brian, that we used to use?" And I says, "Yeah, I got a little bit." He says, "Yeah, I can't find any." So he loves that stuff too, and so do I. I use a lot of anti-seize on pretty much anything I own. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that. So I put my bike all together, and I thought, this is going to be great, except for it didn't have a CD box, and I thought, oh boy. So I went on eBay, and you could buy a used CD box for about $1,000 that you didn't know if it's going to work or not. And I thought, well, have I restored a bike that is going to sit in my living room, and my wife's not going to be happy about that? So I found this company out of Belgium, Electrostator. They built a CD box for me. It looks identical to the original, same fittings and everything. It was about $300, and they'll build them for anything: tractors, airplanes, motorcycles, snowmobiles. So if you got anybody needs a CD box, Electrostator. Cost to rebuild, basically I rebuilt my engine for 7,088 Canadian dollars. Stuff was pretty cheap actually. 2 pistons were $150, so for $300 I got 4 pistons, came with the rings and the pins and the whole 9 yards. The expensive part was basically the hoses for the cooling system. They were $120. Anyway, there you go. The end. Thanks, guys.